Good morning. We are so blessed to have Rabbi Fink talking to us this morning about the Evolving Passover Haggadah. He needs no introduction to this crowd. We are blessed almost yearly to have him speak to us and educate us. So, Rabbi Fink, thank you.
Can everyone hear me now? How's this? All right, good. First, we're going to have a little quiz, a little pretest. Before you hopefully will be able to see most of the components of a Passover Seder. The question is, can you pick out three components that were recited at Passover observances during the days of the Bible, that is from maybe the year 1600 BCE to 100 BCE, over that whole 1500-year period when the Bible was written, the original. Can you pick out three components that might have been recited at a Passover celebration back in biblical days, over 2,000 years ago? Just take a few moments, take a look, see if you can think about what those components might be. Paula and John, can you see okay? Oh, good. Any thoughts? Wine, drinking of wine. Maybe none. Anyone else? 10 plagues. Washing the hands. Of course, the answer that you gave was correct. It's a trick question. None of these components were recited at Passover celebrations for the first 1,500 years of our people's existence. The biblical observance of Passover was very different from the observance of Passover that we observe. And so that's where I'd like to start. I'd like to start by going into our time machine and going back into Jewish history and present a quick survey of the origin and the development of the Passover holiday. How did it begin? What was the Passover story? How did it develop? And then what ritual was or became associated with it? Those are the key questions. What was the Passover story, and what ritual accompanied it? So let's go back to our time machine. And what we have here is a few highlights in Jewish history. Where and how did Passover begin? Around 1600 or 1500 BCE, 3,500 years ago, there is archaeological evidence from ancient Egypt that testifies to a wave of foreign invaders from the north, from the direction of Canaan, which is what Israel was called, excuse me, at that time. These people who immigrated in masses are described in Egyptian sources as what we now know as Semites, and they're called Hyksos in the Egyptian sources, which means rulers from a foreign land, or people from a foreign land. The Hyksos grew in number. The Great Replacement Theory actually began in ancient Egypt, when the Hyksos came and basically took over Egypt, and they conquered Lower Egypt between 1630 and 1523. Roughly 1600 to 1500, these Hyksos actually ruled in Egypt. The archaeological evidence indicates that the Hyksos were, after about a century, defeated by the native Egyptians and thrown out of Egypt. If large numbers of Hyksos tribes remained in Egypt, what would have happened to them? They would have been subjugated. Slaves or servants, second-class citizens. And so if Hebrew tribes were part of this Hyksos wave of immigration to Egypt, probably originally because of famine, which was very common in the Near East at that time, the memory of their oppression might very well be the basis for the Exodus story. The biblical story seems to support an actual memory of an Egyptian experience. A lot of people are asking, did the Exodus really happen, or is it just a myth? The biblical story seems to indicate some actual Egyptian experience. After all, the name of Moses is not a Hebrew word. It's an Egyptian name. We have pharaohs by the name of Tutmosis and Ka-Moses. Ka-Moses was the pharaoh who led the uprising against the Hyksos to take Egypt back for the Egyptians. There are other words that linguists now know are Egyptian that were in the biblical text. The miraculous biblical story, of course, is a myth, I would suggest, but it's likely to have a basis in an actual experience of Hebrew tribes in Egypt and then emigrating from Egypt back to the land of Israel. How do we know that there were actually Israelite tribes back in this ancient period? There is proof. Around 1200, the pharaoh in Egypt, Merneptah, created a monument to himself. Creating monuments to oneself as an autocratic ruler seems to be an ancient tradition. And so Merneptah created this tall monument, the highest monument that could be seen in town. It was a stele, which is the shape that the Washington Monument is in. And this Merneptah stele contained a hieroglyphic that has been translated to describe an encounter with the people of Israel and a great victory in battle over Israel. So we know that there were actually Israelite tribes, at least back around 1200, and most likely even further back than that. Assuming that there were Israelite tribes around that time, archaeologists conjecture that most of the population of Canaan at that time were farmers and shepherds and lived in tribal groups. Israelite tribes were not necessarily so friendly toward each other. And, you know, all families have squabbles, and there were constant squabbles between the tribes. It was very difficult to keep the Hebrew people in all of these various tribes united. But according to biblical history, all of these disparate Israelite tribes became much more united under a succession of kings. When kings came into power in Israel, they tried to undermine the tribal identity and impose a national identity. In about 1000 BCE, King Saul, David, and then Solomon. Now, these tribes probably carried with them various tales and memories of their tribal origins and an experience in Egypt. And that, as a hint, is probably why most scholars believe that the Torah was written by many different authors who finally, at one point, pieced together various recollections from different parts of the Israelite tribes. Well, the kings couldn't hold it together, and in the 900s there was a civil war between the northern and the southern tribes, and two kingdoms were established. We weren't satisfied with just one, we Jews. 2 centuries later, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrian army and disappeared from history, probably assimilating into Assyrian society, and many probably migrated to the southern kingdom, which held firm and survived. The southern kingdom was known as the Kingdom of Judah, whose capital was Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was maintained as the center of Jewish life. At that particular time, let's review what the culture of the Israelites probably included. It included tribal histories and stories of ancestors from both northern and southern kingdoms and various tribes, various tales of an Egyptian experience, and springtime festivals for shepherds and farmers, including a festival that was called Pesach. Most Jewish historians agree that there were actually two distinct spring festivals: Pesach for shepherds and Chag HaMatzot for farmers. Even then, we couldn't agree on one spring holiday. Pesach was a pastoral ritual carried out by the semi-nomadic segment of Israelite society that subsisted on livestock. Spring was a critical time, a time of the lambing, the birth of the new lambs, and hopes of expanding the flock. And so in order to protect flocks and families from the dangers ahead, the cult life, the religious life of the ancient tribes, included a slaughter of the flock's newest addition as a sacrificial offering to God, either a lamb or a kid, followed by a family feast. And this was in order to propitiate, to get in good with God, who would then provide a good flock in the coming spring. Chag HaMatzot, on the other hand, the festival of Matzot, was celebrated by the settled segment of society who lived in villages and drew subsistence from farming, For them, spring was also critical because it was the start of the harvest. Yeast back then was maintained in sourdough balls that were then put in bread, and then new sourdough balls were created from that bread. By the time spring came around, either all of the previous year's grain had been consumed, or it was believed that starting with new yeast would guarantee a good harvest in the coming months. So for a week, farmers did not use leavening when they baked their breads, and that means eating matzah for that week as a sacrifice to God in hopes of a good harvest. Around 622 BCE, the holidays merged. A strong and effective king came into power in Judea, King Josiah, 622. He understood the importance of unity and social cohesion. And so King Josiah, in collaboration with the Levite priests who oversaw the Jerusalem temple, announced to the people an amazing discovery. Josiah had ordered the temple to be renovated. And during this process, as the high priest was clearing the temple's treasure room, imagine what we find if we cleaned out all of the closets here at Oseh Shalom after a few hundred years, God willing. In the temple's treasure room, the Book of the Law, which most scholars think was an early version of the Book of Deuteronomy, was found, discovered, allegedly written in the time of Moses. The Book of Deuteronomy was the first book of the Bible, first book of the Torah to actually be written down, even though it's the last book of the Torah. The first 4 books were written down later on and put together. Then Deuteronomy was placed last. This new book of laws contained laws and observances for the Israelites. The scroll was copied and was read publicly through the entire land, in all of the towns, by the priests, so all could hear about this newly discovered book of law, and people could correct how they were observing their holidays according to the ancient prescription. And according to the new instructions, the 2 holidays were to be merged into one week-long celebration. At the beginning was the Pesach, followed by 7 days of Chag HaMatzot. The location of the celebration was moved from each individual household to the temple in Jerusalem. A clever move to unite the people and to break down the decentralization as the religious life became centralized. And so Pesach was no longer an individual family affair, but was a centralized national observance. The book of Deuteronomy clearly stipulates that Pesach sacrifices may not be made within your homes, but rather at the temple. Why does the book of Deuteronomy have to be so explicit? Because the sacrifices were done at home and needed to be corrected and changed. So following Josiah's reforms, the holiday took the form of mass pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The people would bring their Pesach, their paschal lamb, or their kid, to be sacrificed at the temple. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Chag HaMatzot, began the day after, and everyone was commanded to avoid eating leavened bread for a week. In Deuteronomy, over and over again, God's bringing Israel from slavery to freedom through various miraculous acts is mentioned in a general way dozens and dozens of times as a rationale, a reason to observe these laws and commandments. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Do this because you were slaves in the land of Egypt, over and over again. Matzah is referred to as the bread of haste and is identified as that which was baked by the fleeing Israelites. So Josiah's reform firmly established the memory of the Exodus as the central sacred myth of the Jewish people, and firmly linked the spring Pesach, Chag HaMatzot festival with the Exodus from Egypt. We know in today's world, whoever writes or distributes the history controls the narrative. That's why so many are trying, of course, to erase the history of slavery from our own culture, or to erase the memory of the mass killings of Native Americans from our history. Whoever controls and distributes the history controls the narrative of the culture. And that is what Josiah and the priests did. The historians' take of Josiah's reform was that it appears to be a clever way to unite the nation, to centralize the religious life, boosting, by the way, the power and influence of the Jerusalem monarchy and priesthood. These new practices also functioned to increase social cohesion, because everyone was now on the same page. There was a mass pilgrimage of folks from all over Israel to Jerusalem every spring. This newly centralized observance of Passover promoted a collective identity and greater social cohesion among the people. And so I would suggest that it's clear that both religion and politics were involved in the development of Passover, certainly at this time. And so it was, until 586 BCE, when the Babylonians conquered and sacked Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed, and most of the population was exiled to Babylonia. Passover observances were suspended. The temple was no more. Once Jewish communities were established in Babylonia, priestly scribes and leaders of Judean society who rebounded from the exile wrote the other books of the Torah. They wrote them down from the various disparate traditions so that the people would not forget their history. Whoever writes and distributes the history controls the narrative, and in some ways controls the culture. And so these books of the Torah that were written at that time reflected the writer's current situation of being in bondage in Babylonia and hoping to be delivered by God and delivered to their homeland. An Exodus story was an important tradition to write down by exiles in Babylonia, most likely to embellish or reinforce the social cohesion that had broken down after the war, and to provide hope for a downtrodden people that had been thrown out of their homeland. And so the story of Egyptian bondage in the Babylonian exile went from what was a motivational rationale to observe God's commandments to an aspirational story of an exiled people with unity and hope for a better future. And so it was. In 50 years later, Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, defeated the Babylonians and proclaimed that Jews could return to their homeland. Sometime after, within the next century or so, a temple was rebuilt and Passover, the observance of Passover, was reinstated. Judeans once again would come to Jerusalem for a few days before the holiday and would bring their offerings to the altar at the temple, and then would go home to celebrate Passover for the week. And this form of Passover continued until the revolt of the Jewish people against Rome in the year 66 and the destruction of the temple in the year 70. During the previous century, the Maccabees, who established a kingdom, loosened the rules a little bit and prescribed that the Passover sacrifices could be performed by individual households, but still at the temple. It turns out that the Maccabean kings could not get along with each other, and the family disintegrated, and they invited in the Romans, who took control, established a puppet, and then another Jewish revolt against the Roman rule occurred between the years 66 and 70. One innovation during the Hasmonean time, pre-revolt, during the maybe 100 years BCE, rabbis became popular leaders among the Jewish people. People, it seemed, were fed up with the priests and the corrupt Hasmonean kings, and so these local rabbis became leaders that the people looked to for guidance in their everyday life. In 66, a portion of the Jewish population began the armed rebellion against Rome. The revolt was put down. The temple was destroyed. The Jewish people were either exiled or the few remaining Jews were subjugated in the land of Israel. And Passover was never observed in the same way again. The rabbis, though, negotiated a truce with the Romans. They offered to abandon all military agitation against Roman rule in exchange for a measure of autonomy to control their own communities. And the Romans went for that as long as the Jews would pay their taxes. And so it was up to the rabbis to figure out a way to adapt to this new reality. The temple was destroyed. How could Passover be observed? The rabbis were the new leaders of the Jewish people. Instead of following the practices of the now destroyed temple, the rabbis began to prescribe a Passover observance that centered around a family meal focused almost exclusively on commemorating the Exodus, while only symbolically recalling the sacrifices in the temple with a shank bone at the Passover meal. Even after this truce was worked out, some portions of the Jewish community, even rabbis, still agitated to overthrow Rome. And so another revolt broke out in the year 132 that was finally put down in a bloody purge of Jews throughout the land of Israel. And so there was a small remnant of rabbis and Jewish community left in Israel, and the rest of the Jewish community was spread out throughout the world. Fortunately, this new Passover observance, sitting around a table at home, telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt, was portable and could affirm not only the ancient holiday of Passover, could serve to maintain a Jewish identity. Every year we were once slaves in Egypt, then we were free, we came from the tribes, but also provided a hope that one day the bondage, the exile would end, and next year we would be back in Jerusalem. Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim. And so the Passover Seder as we know it only began in the first 100 years of the Common Era and is only about 2,000 years old, and that is the age of the earliest Haggadah. In the Seder, in the Passover observance, the rabbis wanted to make sure in subsequent generations that Jews who lived under foreign rulers would not be considered threats. And so they took Moses out of the telling of the story of the Exodus from Egypt. In the Haggadah, when we tell the story of the Exodus, Moses is never mentioned. Because if we're in a foreign land and we have a Passover Seders and we tell the story and we talk about Moses, this great leader who led a revolt against the rulers of the time, that might not go over so well. And so instead, the Seder talks about God's miracles that saved the Jewish people in ancient Egypt, having nothing to do with today's life under the rule of whatever foreign ruler there was. And so Jews would be seen as less of a threat. The same kind of dynamic, by the way, occurred during Hanukkah. It was at this time that the Hanukkah story changed from a revolution of the Maccabees to a newly created myth of the miracle of the 8 days. And so that's why in Hanukkah, during our observance, traditionally, we don't speak so much about the revolt, about the Maccabees, although in modern times, post-Holocaust we have, but traditionally, all we focus on is God's miracle of the 8 days, as opposed to the revolution. And so this new Passover observance shed its former connections, direct connections to the land, the priesthood, and the temple, while promoting an ancient Exodus story as a central myth of the Jewish people, who are now scattered geographically and whose former religious institutions were destroyed. And so this Passover Seder, from a sociological point of view, was so important in maintaining our identity in foreign lands and in holding on to hope that one day we would once again be united in our formal glory. So now let's look at the development of the Haggadah. The development of Haggadah traditions as we know them today. The Haggadah is like a layer cake. It was composed in layers. And there are a number of historical periods that added to the various layers. At the bottom of this page, you see these various periods of history. The biblical period, where there was no Haggadah. The period of the Mishnah, which was the book of laws that the rabbis created after the destruction of the temple during those first few hundred years, that has the first inklings of an early Haggadah. The Mishnah was expanded during the period of the Talmud, from 250 to around 600, which greatly expanded the laws and the practices of the people. The Gaonic period occurred from 600 to 1100. The Talmud had been written, and Jewish leaders called Gaonim were looked to make various rulings if there were any disputes among the local rabbis. And then the medieval period began in the 1100s, and the next period of the development of the Haggadah, I'm simply lumping from the medieval period to the present time. So let's start with the period of the Mishnah. You see here the various layers. Red is the Mishnah, green is the Talmud, Blue is the Gaonic period, and purple indicates from the medieval period on. The Haggadah was more or less fixed by about the year 800, although there were a few additions during the medieval time. So let's start with the beginning. What were the early inklings of the Haggadah? In the Mishnah, the Passover Seder was very simple. 4 cups of wine. So whoever said wine is one of the original parts of the Haggadah was in fact correct. The eating of a green vegetable and bitter herbs. The asking of 4 questions and the telling of the Exodus story. Although the 4 questions originally were different than they are now. That is, the third question was. The third question, according to the Mishnah, was, why is it that we eat roasted meat during our family meal? And that apparently was too close a reference to the ancient Passover offering of the temple, which was associated with the revolution. So that eventually got censored, and the rabbis instead inserted, why do we recline on Passover? We recline because we want to remember the exodus from Egypt when God saved us and we became a free people. A little more general than the reference specifically to the temple tradition. Rabbi Gamliel requires a discussion of Pesach, of the shank bone, and of matzah and maror, the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs. There's a blessing after the meal and a recitation of psalms of praise. Those were the original layers. And then in Talmudic times, the rabbis began to add rules. You wash your hands and you say a blessing. The 4 children were created in Talmudic times, although originally in the Talmud, the simple son was not described as the simple son. He was described as the stupid son. The Hebrew is not tam, which means simple, but tipesh, which means idiot, for what that's worth. And that was changed later on to the simple son. There were many more blessings over the matzah, and charoset became a popular dish that was added. The idea that it represented the mortar of the bricks, well, that came after the original Seder. That was added by the rabbis. A nice touch, a nice, delicious touch. And they created what we now know as the Birkat Hamazon, the full blessings after the meal, because that was part of the rules. All of the blessings that you have to say added to the Seder. And then, in Gaonic times, the phrase halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction, was added. The recitation of the 10 plagues came rather late, after the 600s. And Dayenu was also created at that time. Finally, we fill in with medieval times. The order of the Seder was finally completed around 800 or so, and so the acronym for all of the components of the Seder could be inserted into the Seder because the Seder was then complete. And so around 800 plus, we have more or less the Seder and the Haggadah as we know it today. Let me pause now and just ask if there are questions, because next, what I'd like to do is talk about the variety of Haggadahs and supplements that we find today and historically, and the history of new and creative Haggadahs, plus a few extra items. Any questions or any comments about this quick history of Passover and the Haggadah? Mark had it.
Where did they originate?
The account of the 10 plagues comes from the biblical account, but the recitation of the 10 plagues and the taking out of a drop of wine, that was inserted into the Seder in 800. So it's the recitation of the 10 plagues. Thank you for clarifying.
I have a question. the Last Supper was said to be a Seder. Is that a myth?
The Last Seder as a Passover Seder is a myth because there was no such thing as a Passover Seder at the time of Jesus. Secondly, we know that it is a myth created because even the synoptic Gospels themselves in the New Testament disagree on the date of the Last Supper. 3 of the 4 synoptic Gospels put the Last Supper as a Passover Seder because he who writes and distributes the history controls the narrative. Their agenda was to associate Jesus with the Paschal Lamb, with the offering. And so they wrote the story of the Last Supper so that Jesus could be associated as the Paschal Passover offering, giving his life for the salvation of humanity. In the book of John, however, the Last Supper, is located the day before Passover. And so even in early Christian traditions, you have many different writings describing the Last Supper, each with its own particular agenda. Linda had a question back here.
So I find it interesting that the history you provided to us says that they emphasized the miracle because they didn't want to be seen as a threat. That has never been revealed in any time in my life. You know, that I certainly learned we didn't want to focus on the fighting, but never was it said that because people didn't want to appear aggressive, that we did not focus on it.
That observation, which is sociological and historical, is more commonly made in relation to Hanukkah, when people talk about the 2 Hanukkah stories. You may have heard rabbis, I know I've talked about that in the past, talk about why there are 2 different stories, and why post-Holocaust the story of the Maccabean revolt was more emphasized than the miracle of God. But before the Holocaust, when Jews were subjugated among other peoples, the miracle of the lights were created by the rabbis of the Mishnah after the destruction of the temple. But this is not something we teach in Hebrew school. In Hebrew school, we just teach the narrative. All right. John had a... yeah. Yes.
Okay. Forgive my innocence, my lack of knowledge on this, but what is the significance of hiding, finding, and eating the afikomen, other than kids having fun?
The afikomen was a late addition, and I don't know, and I haven't found why the hiding of the afikomen became a tradition. Perhaps it was when some of the songs to entertain children were added to the Seder to make the Seder more palatable to the youngsters that were there. But the afikomen is mentioned in the Mishnah in a totally different context. In the discussion of Passover, the rabbis outline this is what is to be done during the emerging Passover Seder, but the afikomen is not to be observed at the conclusion of the Seder. The Mishnah actually says you don't do the afikomen at the end of the Seder. And here, 1,000 years later, 800 years later, suddenly the afikomen appears. Apparently, the origin of the afikomen, as many historians suggest, was the after-dinner parties that would take place in Roman society. People would get together for dinner, the aristocrats, and then they would go to each other's houses and drink and revel and have celebrations and parties after dinner. Apparently, the rabbis were suggesting we recline like the Romans do to symbolize our freedom, but we don't go out partying after dinner. That we don't do. Yes, afikomen is a Greek word, and it was described in the Roman society, and it could have had its origin in the Greek world. also, but we know that it was practiced in Roman society among the aristocrats. And John, last question before we go on.
Kind of a comment. I really like the way you've laid this out because it helps me understand why rabbis are mentioned so much. in the Haggadah. Like, what are these? You don't get that in other.
Why are rabbis mentioned
Now
so
I
much,
see
John?
why. You're building brick by brick, and they're kind of referring back to each other and assembling this thing over time. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and whoever writes and transmits the history controls the agenda. And, of course, the more the rabbis are mentioned, the more they themselves are recognized as the authorities in Jewish life. Why is it then that every pre-Passover season I get 20, 30 emails from various organizations suggesting supplementary readings to my Seder or new Haggadahs that were just published? In the 1980s, you may recall, we saw an explosion of supplements relating to Soviet Jewry. The matzah, raise your matzah, it was suggested. This is the bread of affliction for Soviet Jews, for the refuseniks, who were jailed and harassed because of their desire to learn Hebrew and emigrate from the Soviet Union to either Israel or the United States because of oppression against Jews. There's also some precedent to writing a supplement or a commentary to the Haggadah, viewing the Haggadah as a statement against totalitarianism and authoritarianism that goes back as far back as the early 1900s. Rabbi Shmuel Borenstein, in the early 1900s, wrote as a supplement and a commentary to the Haggadah during the rise of Nazi Germany and fascism throughout the world. Our oppression in Egypt was the archetype of our three major subsequent oppressions: Babylonia, Persia in Purim, and Greece under the Romans. The fourth empire of today, referring to fascism throughout the world, has all three attributes combined. Therefore, we must muster all our strength and remember well that the evil forces in this wicked empire are trying with all their might to destroy our essential Jewish attributes: modesty, generosity, and mercy. We must cultivate the utmost resilience. Creative supplements to the Seder. Have you heard of the orange on the Seder plate? Have some of you ever put an orange on the Seder plate? Oh my goodness, quite a few. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But have you heard of the tomato on the Seder plate? The tomato on the Seder plate recognizes the farm workers who pick tomatoes and other crops in their struggles for justice. Since 2012, the tomato on the Seder plate was introduced to discuss modern-day struggles of farm workers. And then, of course, we come to the orange on the Seder plate. The popularized story is that the daughter of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Susanna Heschel, who was a scholar in her own right, recounted the comment of a traditional rabbi who said, women belong on the bima as much as an orange belongs on the Seder plate. And so, in support of feminist values, she began the tradition of placing an orange on the Seder table, advocating for equal rights for Jewish women within the tradition. It turns out that Heschel herself recounts that she did not refer to a comment about women on the bima. She suggested that that was an urban myth. But it is based on a comment that she heard about gays and lesbians having a place in Jewish life. A traditional rabbi apparently said, gays and lesbians have as much place in Jewish life as an orange on the Seder plate. And so she placed an orange on the Seder plate as an affirmation for complete acceptance and welcoming of gay, lesbian, and non-binary Jews in the Jewish community. But for some reason, and it would be interesting to find out why that didn't take hold, it was transformed into a feminist symbol, and many people use the orange as a symbol of the feminist movement within Jewish life. Pardon me? What about Miriam's cup? How many of you have a Miriam's cup on your table? Virtually everyone. Well, it is obviously commonplace to put a cup of Miriam next to the cup of Elijah. Miriam, the prophetess, the healer, is celebrated alongside other heroes to emphasize women heroes. And this actually began out of the Reconstructionist community in Philadelphia in 1978. Penina Edelman and her friends, who are associated with the nascent Reconstructionist movement, were gathered around her sukkah during Sukkot. Miriam's cup actually began during Sukkot. And they were talking about the custom of ushpizin, of welcoming ancient Jewish patriarchs into the sukkah. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David. And they decided to invite the women forebearers instead of or in addition to the men. And they began chatting about Miriam. And they decided to welcome the presence of Miriam into their sukkah during this ushpizin ritual with a toast holding a cup of water, because water is associated with Miriam, Miriam's well, which of course nourished the Jewish people during their travails. This particular tradition of Miriam's cup was picked up by one of the founders of the Rosh Chodesh movement. How many have participated in a Rosh Chodesh observance? The early Rosh Chodesh movement, which began in Boston, began to use Miriam's cup, inspired by the use of Miriam's cup in the sukkah, and it became part of the Rosh Chodesh tradition to honor Jewish women. And from there, it became so popular in Jewish feminist culture that it was easy to see how it was eventually added to the Passover Seder side by side with Elijah's cup. And such is the history of Miriam's cup. Some questions back here. Comment. Four matzahs at the Seder began with Soviet Jewry and then morphed into a fourth matzah for the four mothers, to add an extra feminist touch. And there was a question over, yeah, Mark?
An interesting symbolism for the orange was the idea that the orange has many segments that are brought together, which is symbolic of bringing.
Fantastic. And that is how our tradition grows through Midrash. Another interpretation of the orange is that the orange, having many segments, as Mark points out, represents the many segments and streams within the Jewish community. We may have very many denominations, so to speak, but ultimately we are one. And Claire? And what I've not heard of the pineapple. What does the pineapple represent? Pineapple represents welcoming the stranger. Do it. So the pineapple, which comes from foreign lands and have to be imported, like our immigrants come from foreign lands, and so we welcome the stranger with the pineapple. Wow, there are so many symbols that we find here. Certainly, we also find, in addition to various symbols, many different Haggadot being published now. We find in 1976, Lilith magazine wrote a women's Haggadah, and that was the start of the tradition for women's Haggadot. In 2016, we found there was a Black Lives Matter Haggadah. Hazon, a Jewish organization supporting the ethical treatment of animals, suggested the following supplement. Hazon has a Haggadah in which, just as the egg can symbolize both mourning and renewal, the egg we choose to put on our table today can reflect either care for living creatures or one of the plagues of our time, which they call factory farming. And so the people from Hazon, perhaps inspired by PETA, considers that the eggs might have come from a factory farm, and so they suggest that vegans or those who observe this particular tradition replace the egg on the Seder plate with an eggplant. Of course, eggplant emojis have quite a different meaning in the modern world, so I don't know if that would be a mixed message of sorts. There you go. The highest Haggadah, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, was a Haggadah full of readings and stories that emphasize welcoming the stranger and the importance of welcoming and supporting immigrants and asylum seekers. And there are other Haggadahs. There are many LGBTQ plus Haggadot, sponsored by Kesher, an organization that supports gay and lesbian rights. There were a number of COVID-19 Haggadahs that emerged during that time. When I recounted the Passover story to my very young grandchildren during the pandemic, I told them that the 10th plague consisted of a terrible pandemic, and the Jewish people knew that vaccinations and masks would keep them healthy, but the Egyptian people did not believe in vaccinations, and they did not wear masks when they should, and so many Egyptians died, but most Jews did not. In some ways, I think that's an even better story for today's times, but it seems to have worked at that time. There is a Shoah Haggadah that emphasizes and recounts the Shoah so that we remember. And there are even many Orthodox supplements, not just creative, liberal supplements and Haggadot. We have the Reconstructionist Haggadah, also the Reform, Conservative, and many Orthodox Haggadahs. There is, let's see, there is the 30-minute Seder. There is the emojis Haggadah. If you want to translate, ask your grandchildren. There is the Maxwell House Haggadah in its various forms, in its ancient form and its more contemporary form from the 70s. How many have used the Maxwell House Haggadah? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Who prints up their own Haggadahs? And now if you go to Haggadah.com, you can actually piece together from various pieces your own Haggadah and print it out. Claire? What's the history of the Maxwell House Haggadah? Oh, okay, because I have no idea. How did it come to be? Interesting. Jewish immigrants stopped buying coffee. They weren't sure if it was kosher, so Maxwell House produced a Haggadah to reinforce and assure Jews that, yes, coffee was kosher for Passover. And so we should ask, how did this trend of Seder supplements and new Haggadot begin? Well, when I was young and more clueless, I thought that the idea of an alternative or contemporary Haggadah began in 1969, which was my last year of high school and first year of college. Because in April 1969, on the first anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, Jewish and African American activists came together in Washington to hold a Passover meal in solidarity, an event that became known as the Freedom Seder. The Haggadah for the Freedom Seder was written and compiled by Arthur Waskow, and it generated considerable controversy, while also sparking new forms of political activism along with religious practice. It interpreted Pesach and the Seder ritual as a call for universal social justice, including racial justice. The Haggadah instructed participants to hum "Solidarity Forever," the 1915 anthem of the American labor movement, or softly play it on guitar as an undertone while the story of the Exodus was read. The assemble then sang the hymn. Waskow took some liberties in rewriting or interpreting the text of the Passover story as well. For example, the story of the Exodus says, or reads in the Freedom Seder, "What was the sign that God had come? It was a bush that burned and burned and did not stop burning. Moses had had a fire kindled in his heart once, but it went out, or at least died down. God is the being whose heart does not stop burning, in whom the flame does not die down." What was God all burned up about? The voice that came out of the bush said, "I have seen the affliction of my people and have heard their cry." It was the physical, economic, and spiritual suffering, the injustice, the degradation to which actual people were subjected here on earth that caused God concern. And the proof that God had entered into Moses and that Moses had really been converted was that he had to go back and identify himself with his enslaved people, organizing them into Brickmakers Union Number 1, and lead them out of Hungary and slavery into freedom and into a land flowing with milk and honey. Shortly after that, all present sang Bob Dylan's "The Times They Are A-Changing." The Freedom Seder included readings from Martin Luther King and quotes that assail corporate greed and power. And it included supplementary readings from Pope John XXIII, Mahatma Gandhi, Herbert Marcuse, Evgeny Evtushenko's poem, Babi Yar, and the Rolling Stones. You get the idea. So you insisted that your parents read from the Freedom Seder. Oh, how radical you are and were. Mm-mm. Well, the spiritual. Well, the Freedom, yes, the Freedom Seder also contained a lot of spirituals. Go Down Moses and others, yes, to identify with the African American experience. Thank you. Claire? Yes. Yes, yes. Absolutely. All of this started much earlier, which I, of course, realized once I became educated. In fact, as early as 1904, Lillian Cowan, the first woman to translate a Haggadah into English, created a Haggadah that included better translations, musical notations so you could play on the piano during the Seder, and included suggestions about what to skip if you were in a hurry. In 1908, and then again in 1923, the Reform movement's new Haggadah began a radical departure from the traditional Haggadah, which was later completed by none other than Mordechai Kaplan, a professor at the Conservative Rabbinical Seminary and founder of the Reconstructionist movement. The 1923 Reform Haggadah cut out major parts of the traditional service. The telling of the Exodus story, which in the tradition contains long midrashic commentaries of early rabbis, was thrown out and replaced with a straightforward narrative from the book of Exodus. The Reform Haggadah omitted references to the 10 plagues as too exceedingly cruel to mention specifically during Passover. It did not include the request that God pour out your wrath upon the Gentile nations when the door is opened for Elijah. And the new Reform Haggadah omitted prayers that the temple be rebuilt and a Messiah descended from King David will arrive. Mordechai Kaplan's congregation, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, printed a supplementary book containing essays and readings the very next year in 1924. But it wasn't until 1941 when Mordechai Kaplan, his son-in-law, Rabbi Ira Eisenstein, and their colleague, Rabbi Eugene Cohn, known as the Father, the Son-in-law, and the Holy Ghost writer back in that time, published what they called the New Haggadah in 1941. It was the first Haggadah of its kind that refashioned and reframed the telling of the Passover story rather than simply quoting ancient texts. Written at the time of the beginning of the Nazi onslaught in Europe and the rise of fascism in the United States and throughout the world, Kaplan used the Seder text to urge Jews to fight for universal freedom and democracy and to stand against authoritarianism. Kaplan's new Haggadah pioneered, in many ways, the subsequent explosion of creative and diverse Haggadah texts, revisions of the text that speak both to religion and politics, Judaism and democracy, social and economic justice. In a 1924 essay on Passover, Kaplan wrote this: "In celebrating the Passover festival, we should bear in mind the entire series of events in human history which form the milestones in the progress toward freedom and justice. We should behold the power and righteousness of God in the overthrow of feudalism, in the abolition of slavery, and in the destruction of all forms of autocracy." What's the old saying? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Like the older Reform Haggadah, Kaplan's new Haggadah included musical notations, omitted the recitation of the 10 plagues, the statement that God should pour out his wrath, and omitted were prayers for the coming of a Messiah, son of David, as opposed to the era of the Messiah, which was included in the Seder. But the new Haggadah, Kaplan's new Haggadah, broke new ground in a number of ways. First, we may be used to it by now, but the Haggadah was one of the first printed texts that omitted references to Jews as the chosen people in the Kiddush, a radical move at the time that was condemned widely. And Kaplan wrote at that time he was proud to have, quote, had the courage to go through with the excision of such a cancerous growth from the Jewish consciousness. He had guts. Other texts that Kaplan considered problematic were also omitted, such as the verse of Dayenu that refers to the reestablishment of the Jerusalem temple. His Haggadah was unlike any other previous in some ways, because rather than just translate traditional Hebrew, he added new text which spoke to contemporary social issues. For example, when the matzah was raised, the Reconstructionist Haggadah has us say, "Let us here resolve to strive for that blessed day when all will share equally in the joy of Pesach, when poverty will be no more, and when all mankind will enjoy freedom, justice, and peace. Though the sacrifice be great and hardships many, we shall not rest until the chains that enslave all people be broken. We can be enslaved by poverty and inequality. When work we do enriches others, but leaves us in want of shelter and food and warm clothes, we are slaves. We can be enslaved by intolerance. Pesach calls us to be free from the enslavement of poverty and inequality, free from the corroding hate that eats away the ties which unite mankind." Today, that kind of text would not be considered particularly radical, but it was a tremendous departure in 1941. And lastly, Kaplan also welcomed and encouraged the idea of many different Haggadah texts. And of course, that was the foundation for what became the proliferation of so many texts of the Haggadah. Kaplan's rabbinical colleagues at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative seminary, co-signed a letter in response to Kaplan's new Haggadah that stated, after it was rewritten to sound less harsh, the letter said, "We completely dissociate ourselves from your views on Jewish theology and consider much of your approach contrary to the letter and the spirit of Jewish tradition." They also refused to call his new text a Haggadah, suggesting that what he composed was not really a Haggadah, but was simply a new Passover service. Historian Deborah Moore. What's the difference? I think it's a distinction without a difference. But they didn't want to call it a Haggadah, like perhaps many ultra-Orthodox Jews don't consider us to be real Jews. That was not a real Haggadah, but a fake imitation. Historian Deborah Moore notes that the new Haggadah was a mixed success. Its first printing sold out within 10 days, and it remained in print in revised edition for at least 60 years. But it did not become the Haggadah of choice for American Jews. Deborah Moore says, the Free Maxwell House Haggadah probably holds that position and was used by President Barack Obama at the first White House Seder. Little did I know in 1969 that Arthur Waskow's Freedom Seder was not the first socially conscious, social justice-oriented Haggadah, but it did usher in a new generation of creative and new Haggadahs. But it turns out to have been standing on the shoulders of the new Haggadah from an earlier generation, published in 1941 by Mordechai Kaplan. And so we see here, too, that those who control the history, the recitation of history, the distribution of history, control the narrative. And the particular agenda that accompanies it is often not only influenced by what we might call pure spiritual aspirations, but by political and social concerns as well throughout the thousands of years of Jewish history. And so now what I'd like to do, we're on for an hour and a half, yes? Okay. In the last 20 minutes, I'd like to share some of the illuminated manuscripts that were produced around the 13 to 1500s. To get an idea of how the Haggadahs, during that explosion of the illumination, of the manuscript illumination art, was brought into the world of the Haggadah. This is known as the Bird's Head Haggadah from Germany around 1300. You see the Jewish heads in this Haggadah are birds' heads. They're not human heads. Apparently, the artist took very literally the prohibition of creating a human form in sacred traditions, which of course is part of the Muslim tradition also, and so he gave everyone birds' heads. And here are some other pages. The top is a right-handed page, Pharaoh's army. They have birds' heads too, except Pharaoh, whose face is blanked out, and he's wearing the crown, so we know who Pharaoh is in this top panel. And in the lower panel are the Jewish people apparently taking their matzahs out of the oven and packing them up as they flee from Egypt. Can everybody see that relatively well? The Rylands Haggadah from the 1300s in Spain. This is the commentary of Maror Zeh. This is the bitter herb. And I guess that's the picture of the leaf of the bitter herb. And the lower portion of the panel has the husband pointing to his wife and saying, Maror Zeh, this bitterness, apparently it was something of a joke. At least I hope it was something of a joke in which the husband was just using the old Henny Youngman, take my wife, please, sort of thing in this misogynistic way. Again, in 1300 Spain, a page from a Haggadah from the Hallel, B'tzeit Yisrael miMitzrayim, from Psalm 114. In the lower left-hand corner of the picture, you see a dog, and here's a blow-up. The dog does not have a tongue. According to Exodus, the Exodus text says, not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at human or animal, in order that you may know that God makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. So this reflects that particular biblical passage. I mean, these are really magnificent. Imagine all of the wealthy Jews who could afford to purchase an illuminated Haggadah, and how well they must have been treasured. In 1320, this is known as the Golden Haggadah for obvious reasons, we find 4 panels. Panels that include let's see, this must be Moses and Zipporah, and sorry, this is the burning bush. Yes, in the upper left-hand corner, that's the bush burning. So this is the panel of the burning bush. This is the panel of Moses, Zipporah, his wife, and the infants, their children, Gershom and Eliezer, as they're traveling through Midian. This panel depicts Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh. Obviously, in ancient Egypt, they were dressed like that, like Spaniards in 1320, when the Haggadah was written. Pharaoh has his scepter with a fleur-de-lis at the top, the well-known symbol of ancient Egypt. And a panel of the episode where Moses' staff turns into a snake and eats the snakes, the staffs of all of the wizards and magicians of the Pharaoh. We have here the Sarajevo Haggadah. Many of you have read the history, the book that told about the history of the Sarajevo Haggadah, commissioned around 1350 in Barcelona. It may have been a wedding present for members of two leading Jewish families who are named Shoshan and Elazar, and their respective coats of arms appear prominently on the page as the emblem of the city of Barcelona. A note added to the text in 1609, someone wrote in the margin, this book does not contain anything directed against the church, suggesting that it came under scrutiny by the Inquisition. And since the late 19th century, of course, it's been considered a great treasure of the city of Sarajevo. It was taken out of Spain during the 1492 expulsion, resurfaced in Italy 100 years later, sold to the National Museum in Sarajevo in 1894. During World War II, the museum's chief librarian smuggled the Haggadah out of Sarajevo, away from the Nazis, saved it from destruction during the war that racked the city. It later survived a museum looting during the Bosnian War in 1992 and is now on permanent display in the National Museum of Sarajevo. More panels from the Sarajevo Haggadah, obviously worn with time. The Seder, the drinking of the wine, the matzahs on the table, the bowls on the left side containing perhaps charoset, bitter herbs. Scenes from the story of Joseph. The upper panel, Joseph's two brothers are pushing him down the well, or the cavern or whatever it was, but it looks like a Spanish well. And in the lower panel, he's being sold to the caravaneers who appear to be African, sold into slavery. A German Haggadah from 1400. Rabbis are seated at the Seder table reading the Haggadah, and they have what was common to the Jewish community, these pointed hats. This is a page from another German Haggadah. These I believe were hand drawn. These are hand drawn manuscripts and hand illuminated. You're right. So these are photos of those original manuscript pages. Exactly. There was no color printing. Right. These were all hand decorated manuscripts with gold leaf and various colors. So it was a magnificent tradition and painstaking to come up with something like that. Thanks for the clarification. More of the page from the Darmstadt Haggadah showing women studying Tanakh with male teachers. So apparently in Germany in the 1420s, women were allowed to be educated and study with tutors. And the blow-up of the Seder table from the Darmstadt German Haggadah of 1420. The Haggadah was read by the head of the household and everyone else listened. The idea of passing around parts only came after the printing press, or in families that could afford more than one hand-inscribed Haggadah. Just like the Torah is read to the public, it was read that way because in ancient times no one had books. And so it was read aloud by the head of the household. Yeah, some of our parents or grandparents may have had that tradition where the head of the household sat and read the Haggadah and everyone else yawned and squirmed until the boring part was over. Yes, Marla? Pardon me? Elijah comes into being much later in the medieval times, the opening the door for Elijah. And so that's one of the late additions. And we have in the corner just a pet dog. Apparently, German Jews had pets in the 1400s. With a tongue, right. That's why we know it's not part of the Passover story, but perhaps a family pet. Perhaps this was commissioned by a particular family, and they wanted to include the dog. Okay, this is a German Haggadah in 1450, the opening text of the Haggadah, Halach Ma'anya. Oh, look, yes, tomatoes at the top of the page. Workers unite. This was from 1450. Well, no, I think they were tongue in cheek. Those are actually just flowers if you look real closely. But those in the back, it looks like a tomato. But yeah. And from 1478, the door opens to Elijah, and this is the part where we say, Shvoch Hamatcha, may God pour out your wrath against the Gentiles in the world. When we open the door for Elijah and we sing, Oh, Eliyahu Hanavi, and at the same time we're saying, pour out your wrath at the non-Jews. Barbara? A tradition in the family, single females had to stand by the door when the door was opened for Elijah to wait for a suitable mate, apparently. How humiliating. Oh my God. Oh. Wow. I had never heard that before. I wonder if that's just a family thing. Yeah, a family Baba Meiser. The first Cincinnati Haggadah. Haggadahs are named after generally the places where they were originated or the places where the museums are that hold them. The Cincinnati Haggadah from Germany in 1480.
So the things that distinguish these Haggadahs are their illumination, not
Exactly. The content is the same. The illuminations all vary. And many Haggadahs, as I mentioned, were commissioned by wealthy Jews so that artists could make them a special custom-made Haggadah. Here in the upper right-hand corner, this is the passage that we say when we search for the chametz the night before Passover, and we brush crumbs of chametz with a feather in the upper right-hand corner. We brush with the feather into a bowl to get rid of all of our chametz. In this family, this may have been a particularly enjoyable and popular tradition. This is a Haggadah moving ahead in time, 1733, from Fürth, Germany. You can see the writing, the title page, Seder Haggadah Shel Pesach. And below there is Amsterdam. Who are these men? I do not know. That's a good question. That will be your homework. And where did these angels at the top come from? And who decided that they should portray the angelic beings as cherubs, which was obviously popular art of the time. Here we have a Haggadah from 1934 from Poland, from Lodz, Poland. A page, and this may have been printed. Originally it was hand done, but this may have been printed also. And it portrays the 4 sons. Let's look at them more closely. The wise son is a Chassid. See, he's got the talus and the tzitzit hanging down, and he's wearing what the Polish Hasidim, Orthodox Jews might wear when they dress up, and got the side locks and the yarmulke. You know, obviously not an accurate depiction of the time of the Mishnah, but expressive of the contemporary world. And here we have the Rasha, the wicked one. Yeah, looks like an Aryan aristocrat with the riding crop and boots, and yeah, the wicked one. The simple one, Tom, what me worry? And again with the tzitzit worn under the clothes, hanging down, which was common, and the payas, the side locks, and the one who does not know how to ask. He's a grunt, maybe a miner or a forester. He works with his hands. He's a laborer, and he's not very well educated. And so we find so many varieties of Haggadahs and traditions during Passover, beginning with what I became acquainted with in 1969, the Freedom Seder, a new Haggadah for Passover, and then Mordechai Kaplan's new Haggadah, which of course was new at the time, and this is the title page, Kaplan, Cohen, and Eisenstein. And the graphics in the new Haggadah symbolized the idea of enslavement and the need to be free from autocracy and authoritarianism in 1941. And that brings us back to our contemporary Seders, which sometimes we want to get through as soon as possible. And that brings this presentation to a close. And so I thank you for your attention. Are there refreshments in the social hall for people to mingle a bit? Rebecca. Yes, Rabbi Rebecca. Thanks. I should end with one quick thought, and that is that some people are very disappointed to hear that the story that we read in the Torah about the Exodus from Egypt might not have happened in any way similar to what the story actually reads. And I'm often asked, did the Exodus really happen? And of course, my answer is, does it really matter? Because this is the story of our people. And it is the story of not only our identity, but a magnificent story that contains such important values that at so many periods in history have been important for the advancement of our society and the uplift of all of us in the Jewish community and humanity at large. So, did the Exodus really happen? Who cares? Pesach is Pesach, and it's a wonderful and important celebration.